Above the sprawling German industrial city of Schweinfurt, death waited in crystalline air. August 17, 1943, brought horror to 25,000 feet. Frozen oxygen hissed against flight masks. Cockpit glass fogged with each desperate breath. Through his fighter's canopy, one German pilot stared at impossible numbers. Hundreds of American bombers stretched across the horizon like a silver avalanche. Their polished aluminum skins caught morning sunlight. Blinding reflections flashed from wing to wing. This was beyond anything German military minds had conceived. The mathematics were insane. 40 German fighters scrambling to intercept hundreds of enemy aircraft. Each flying fortress bristled with 1350 caliber machine guns. Their combat box formations created walls of interlocking fire. Death approached from every angle for defenders brave enough to attack. These were the odds that mocked human courage, numbers that transformed skilled pilots into statistical casualties. The armada above represented something more terrifying than mere air raid. American industrial might had taken physical form. Metal and aluminum given wings. Production capacity transformed into flying destruction. What German eyes witnessed was their nation's doom spelled out in aircraft formations. The reversal happened with shocking speed. German air superiority collapsed between 1943 and 1944. Wehrmacht forces had conquered Europe in 1940. The Luftwaffe had ruled supreme over conquered skies. By August 1943, German pilots watched their world flip upside down. Complete aerial dominance became desperate survival. The transformation defied belief. Masters of the sky became hunted prey. American bombing operations reached scales beyond German comprehension. Mission 84 targeted two critical points. Colonel Curtis LeMay led 146 bombers against Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg. Another 230 bombers struck ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. Strategic thinking was crystal clear. Ball bearings represented bottlenecks in German war production. Messerschmitt plants produced 1/3 of all single-engine fighters. Destroy fighter production while crippling overall manufacturing through bearing shortages. German fighter commander Adolf Galland scrambled everything available. Elite units launched from bases across occupied territory. These were holders of Knight's Crosses and oak leaves. Veterans who had dominated skies over France, Britain, and Russia. Their skill and courage now meant almost nothing against impossible odds. Desperate innovation emerged from desperation. Pilots developed techniques for dropping bombs from fighters onto bomber formations. March 22, 1943, saw the first successful air-to-air bombing attack. One B-17 destroyed using this experimental method. Such innovations were pinpricks against growing American presence. Tactical creativity couldn't overcome strategic reality. Individual brilliance wilted before mass production. October 14, 1943, brought Black Thursday horror. The second Schweinfurt raid saw 291 flying fortresses crossing German airspace. The Luftwaffe mounted one of its last great defensive efforts. Over 300 fighters scrambled from 24 different airfields. Focke-Wulf fighters armed with rocket launchers. German pilots achieved apparent victory. 60 American bombers shot down. A 20% loss rate that forced Americans to suspend deep penetration raids temporarily. But German costs were catastrophic. 38 fighters lost, including irreplaceable veteran pilots. These men represented hundreds of hours of combat experience, training that Germany could never replace. Each loss removed institutional knowledge. Skills developed over years of fighting vanished in minutes of combat. The flying fortress carried formidable defensive armament, positions designed for maximum coverage against attacking fighters. Combat box formations of 18 to 21 aircraft flying mutual support. Devastating firepower against approaching threats. Frontal attacks became suicidal. Beam attacks proved extremely dangerous. German fighters possessed excellent individual capabilities. The Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf were superb aircraft, but reaching bombers grew increasingly difficult. American fighter escorts extended range deep into Germany. P-47 Thunderbolts with drop tanks appeared by late 1943. March 1944 brought P-51 Mustangs over Berlin itself. German fighters fought for survival before reaching bomber streams. Desperation spawned remarkable innovations. The Storm Group concept involved specially armored fighters closing to point-blank range. 30mm cannons delivered devastating firepower. If ammunition was exhausted, pilots rammed bombers. These storm attacks required extraordinary courage. Pilots flew reinforced fighters through bomber formations, sometimes literally chopping through wings with propellers. Metal against metal in aerial collisions. Survival was rarely expected. Germany's elite fighter units tell the story in bloody detail. Named units hemorrhaged experienced pilots at unsustainable rates. One unit lost its commander with 127 victories. Shot down by P-38 Lightnings in May 1944. Between October 1943 and May 1944, veteran commanders died faster than replacements could be trained. One unit claimed over 700 enemy aircraft during the war, but suffered 464 killed in action. Additional 174 wounded and 94 killed in accidents. Casualties exceeded the unit's nominal strength. Mathematics of attrition made victory impossible. Another famous unit maintained channel defenses from 1940 through D-Day. Despite impressive individual kill ratios, catastrophic losses mounted. Of 754 pilots who served during the war, 584 became casualties, a 77% casualty rate that defied sustainability. By December 1943, only 107 of 185 assigned pilots remained available for operations. One anti-bomber specialist unit formed in April 1943. They pioneered rocket attacks against bomber formations. Modified mortars fired time-fused projectiles from 1,000 meters distance. During intensive combat periods, significant bomber kills were claimed. These tactical victories couldn't alter strategic reality. Americans could replace losses. Germany could not. Production capacity determined outcomes. Individual excellence became meaningless against industrial might. The Luftwaffe's training system collapsed more catastrophically than combat losses. Pre-war German pilot training had been exemplary. Over 250 flight hours required, including extensive aerobatics. Formation flying and gunnery practice prepared pilots thoroughly. By 1944, this collapsed to merely 112 hours, often incomplete due to fuel shortages. American training provided stark contrast. U.S. Army Air Force pilots received over 300 flight hours before combat. They arrived at units fully trained and combat-ready. German pilots by 1944 arrived barely able to fly their aircraft. Combat effectiveness was non-existent. Young men with perhaps 100 hours total flying time, maybe 10 hours on specific fighter types. Frontline units received these barely trained pilots. 2 weeks to make them combat-ready. Most were dead within 5 missions. The statistics revealed deadly cycles. First 6 months of 1943 saw 1,100 fighter pilots lost. 60% of January strength vanished. By 1944, monthly attrition reached 25%. Fighter units experienced complete turnover every 4 months. Only commanders possessed meaningful combat experience. Most pilots had 8 to 30 days active service before becoming casualties. Fresh faces arrived weekly. Veterans watched replacements die with predictable regularity. The Allied oil campaign delivered the death blow. Germany's synthetic fuel plants produced 124,000 barrels daily in early 1944. These facilities provided 92% of aviation fuel. Primary targets beginning May 1944. May 12, 1944, brought 935 bombers striking synthetic oil plants. Immediate impact was catastrophic beyond description. Production fell from 175,000 tons in April to 52,000 tons in June. July saw 35,000 tons. September barely managed 5,000 tons. Albert Speer reported 98% of aviation fuel plants out of operation. The irony was bitter beyond words. German aircraft production reached unprecedented levels. 39,177 aircraft in 1944, including 24,181 fighters. Monthly fighter production peaked at 3,031 in September 1944. But these aircraft sat idle on airfields. No fuel to fly them. No trained pilots to operate them. Ground crews used oxygen bottles to move aircraft. Precious fuel was conserved for actual combat missions. November 1944 saw training flights suspended entirely. Combat units operated on 10% of minimum required fuel. Pilots restricted to one training flight monthly. February 1945 brought synthetic fuel production to 0.5% of early 1944 levels. Complete industrial collapse. Modern aircraft became expensive ground ornaments. Victory through production strangulation. Psychological destruction preceded physical annihilation for German fighter pilots. Veterans who entered war as confident warriors gradually transformed into fatalistic survivors. Hunters became hunted, became mere targets. The crisis culminated in an unprecedented fighter pilots' revolt. January 22, 1945, saw Germany's most decorated aces confront Hermann Göring. This mutiny represented complete breakdown of trust between frontline pilots and leadership. Concrete grievances were presented. Continued accusations of cowardice despite impossible odds. Incompetent operational leadership. The dismissal of effective commanders. Me-262 jets should be released for fighter operations immediately. Göring's response revealed complete disconnection from battlefield reality. He accused national heroes of treason, threatened execution for telling truth. When shown wreckage of American fighters shot down over Germany, he declared it impossible. These aircraft must have glided from outside German airspace. Instead of executing the mutinous pilots, they were national heroes. Göring dispersed them to harmless positions. Banishment rather than bullets. Operation Argument delivered the decisive blow. Big Week from February 20 to 25, 1944, saw over 3,000 bomber sorties. 500 additional sorties from another air force. RAF night raids added pressure. 10,000 tons of bombs dropped on aircraft factories. February 20th alone saw 1,003 American bombers escorted by 835 fighters. Multiple cities attacked simultaneously. The Luftwaffe mustered only fragmented resistance, perhaps 150 fighters total, against over 1,800 enemy aircraft. Reality was recorded in pilot diaries. 8 aircraft took off, 2 aborted with engine problems. Of 6 that engaged bombers, only 2 returned. The sky was full of Mustangs. No escape possible. Week's end brought devastating German losses. 262 fighters destroyed. Approximately 100 experienced pilots killed. Among the dead was another veteran with 110 victories. Americans lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters. Losses they replaced within days. Big Week demonstrated definitively that American fighters now owned German airspace. No contest remained. March 6, 1944, marked psychological end for German resistance. 730 bombers attacked Berlin in daylight. 800 fighters provided escort, including P-51 Mustangs. For German pilots, seeing American fighters over their capital shattered final illusions. The war was lost. The Luftwaffe mounted 83 sorties against this massive raid. Results were predictable. Heavy German losses for minimal impact. German pilots watched their capital burn while unable to intervene effectively. March 6, 1944 was when absolute certainty arrived. Not because Berlin was bombed again, but because it was bombed in daylight. Americans losing barely 5%, while Germans lost 30%. German ace memoirs provide intimate testimony to this journey from supremacy to annihilation. These were elite pilots, yet they found themselves overwhelmed by sheer material superiority. Their aggressive spirit meant nothing. Joy of action became fear of death. Passion of the hunter transformed into desperation of the hunted. Narrow, confined tasks robbed them of initiative. Best qualities stripped away by circumstances. By the time these events occurred, Reich leaders had abandoned every standard of responsible action, both toward their own people and toward enemies. Fighter pilots were caught in this madness. Early war enthusiasm had evaporated completely. The prospect of experiencing war lost all appeal. By 1944, impossibility of their situation was recorded daily. Pointlessness of continued resistance against overwhelming numerical superiority. The progression was clear to those who lived it. 1940 brought complete sky ownership. 1941 meant sharing airspace with RAF. 1943 brought disputes with Americans. 1944 meant merely trying to survive. The Me-262 represented German technical superiority rendered meaningless by strategic incompetence. World's first operational jet fighter, capable of 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter, should have changed everything. Germany produced approximately 1,432 Me-262s. But Hitler's insistence on bomber use delayed fighter deployment until late 1944. Even demonstration flights focused on bomb capacity rather than fighter potential. When finally permitted as fighters, fuel shortages and training deficits limited operations severely. One jet unit could rarely put 30 aircraft airborne simultaneously. Against thousand-plane raids, revolutionary technology proved insufficient. June 6, 1944, demonstrated complete Luftwaffe collapse. Despite years preparing for invasion, only 100 operational fighters were available. Against them, Allies launched 11,590 sorties on D-Day alone. The Luftwaffe managed 319 sorties total, just 35 by fighters. One commander's response became legendary for its futility. Entire units had been relocated days before, leaving only 2 fighters at forward bases. Ordered to attack invasion beaches, the response was predictable. Attack the invasion with 2 fighters? Complete insanity. One strafing pass over beaches before fleeing. Effectively daylight response to history's greatest amphibious invasion. Fighter pilot casualties reached catastrophic levels beyond sustainability. 26,800 fighter pilots killed or missing during the war. Monthly loss rates by 1944 became mathematically impossible to sustain. January 1944 brought 16.9% losses. February reached 18.2%. March climbed to 21.7%. April saw 19.8% casualties. May jumped to 24.33% losses. June peaked at 25.8% casualties. These percentages meant complete unit turnover every 4 months. Entire flying schools graduated directly into death. December 1943 graduation class suffered 80% casualties within 3 months of assignment. Individual units hemorrhaged pilots at unsustainable rates. Between January and June 1944, major units lost dozens of pilots each. When commanders took charge in early 1943, They had dozens of pilots with over 100 missions. By June 1944, perhaps 3 remained alive. German intelligence catastrophically underestimated American production capabilities. 1942 estimates of 18,000 aircraft faced reality of 47,836 produced. 1943 estimates of 30,000 met actual production of 85,898. 1944 estimates of 50,000 confronted reality of 96,018 American aircraft. When reports showed American fighter production reaching 3,000 monthly, they were burned as propaganda. Actual production exceeded 3,600 fighters per month. B-17 production alone saw 12,731 completed. Boeing's Seattle plant completed 16 daily at peak production. Ford's factory produced 1 B-24 every 63 minutes. German production peaked at 39,877 aircraft in 1944, when neither fuel nor pilots existed to fly them. America alone produced 96,318 that year. Adding British and Soviet production created 4-to-1 disadvantage Germany couldn't overcome. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Of 1,000-plus fighters supposedly available, perhaps 100 could fly daily. Fuel permitted 1 sortie weekly per pilot. Most pilots had under 50 hours flight time. Final missions were flown with certainty of defeat. Diaries captured the reality. Worn aircraft, exhausted pilots, empty fuel tanks. The mathematics evident since 1943 had reached inevitable conclusion. Luftwaffe losses were staggering. Approximately 76,875 aircraft lost during the war, 43,000 in combat operations. Human losses were even more devastating. 165,000 aircrew killed, 155,000 wounded, 192,000 missing or captured. Against this, one American Air Force lost 26,000, killed from over 350,000 who served. Grievous but sustainable losses. Production differential was insurmountable. 1944 alone saw Allies produce 163,999 aircraft versus Germany's 39,877. No amount of courage could overcome such disparity. Individual excellence wilted before systemic superiority. Destruction of the Luftwaffe offers enduring lessons about industrial warfare. German pilots were initially world's best trained and most experienced. They were destroyed not through lacking courage. Mathematical inevitability determined outcomes. American approach of mass production and adequate training for many proved superior. Sustainable losses versus individual excellence. While German aces accumulated spectacular scores, they couldn't alter outcomes determined by production statistics. When handfuls of German fighters faced massive formations, they witnessed industrial warfare's reality. Individual excellence cannot overcome systemic superiority. When industrial differential reaches sufficient levels, outcomes become mathematically certain. German fighter pilots witnessed something unprecedented in 1943 to 1944. Complete airspace dominance through industrial might. Veterans described skies filled with silver bombers stretching beyond horizon. Metallic tide announcing military defeat and end of an era. Transformation from hunter to hunted occurred with shocking speed. 1940 brought German fighters sweeping opposition from European skies. 1944 left them barely able to defend their own airfields. This wasn't gradual decline, but catastrophic collapse. Fighter pilots' revolt of January 1945 represented final acknowledgement by those who had denied reality longest. When Germany's greatest aces told leadership the truth, they voiced what every pilot knew. German pilots learned modern warfare's hardest lesson. Individual excellence cannot overcome systemic superiority. They flew knowing defeat was certain. Their sacrifice would change nothing. They flew anyway from duty, habit, or because they knew nothing else. In their defeat lay profound lessons about production and power, about courage's limits against material superiority. German pilots who faced bomber armadas didn't just lose a war. They witnessed warfare's transformation into industrial equation with predetermined outcomes. Their testimony stands as historical witness. They fought mathematical certainty and lost, not from lacking skill or courage. They faced an enemy that had transformed war into industrial mathematics. German fighter pilots of 1943 to 1945 learned in blood a fundamental truth. When sky fills with enough metal, individual warriors become irrelevant. Age of the ace had ended. Age of mass production had begun. Above Schweinfurt on August 17, 1943, frozen pilots stared at their future. Silver bombers stretching beyond sight. Each formation representing industrial capacity beyond German comprehension. Mathematics made manifest in aluminum and steel. The aerial glacier flowing across German skies carried more than bombs. It carried the promise of inevitable defeat. Production statistics given physical form. American industrial might transformed into flying destruction. German pilots who witnessed this armada saw their nation's fate written in aircraft formations. No courage could alter equations already solved in Detroit factories. No skill could overcome advantages measured in production quotas. When oxygen masks froze against pilot faces at 25,000 feet, they breathed air already thick with defeat. The sky belonged to others now. Mathematics had spoken. Industrial warfare had rendered individual excellence meaningless. The silver tide above announced not just bombing raid, but transformation of warfare itself. From individual skill to mass production. From pilot against pilot to factory against factory. The age of the ace was ending in the crystalline air above Germany.